This morning's scripture reading will be taken from Hebrews chapter 11, verses 32 through 35 and 38. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. We may receive back their dead by resurrection, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth.
Good morning, church. A few months ago, Jeb came and asked me if I would speak for him this morning. And when he told me that the topic would be on Elijah, I was excited. Because since I've been little, this person has been one of my favorite characters in the Old Testament. And so as we may have noticed, Elijah's name is not mentioned in the book of Hebrews, but the things that he did most certainly are. And we will see that as we work through his story this morning. So I'm going to attempt to cover what the Bible talks about in terms of Elijah, which is a lot. His story covers 5 chapters across 2 different books. But before we get into Elijah, let's talk a little bit about the setting. What was going on in Israel when Elijah was sent? So Elijah preached starting during the reign of Ahab, king of Samaria, which was the capital city of the northern kingdom of Israel. He was described as even worse than Jeroboam. And Jeroboam's sin was that he created idols and told the people to worship them in place of God. Ahab did the same thing, but even went beyond that, just calling idol worship acceptable. He actually made a political alliance with a foreign pagan ruler by marrying his daughter, Jezebel. And then he worshiped that country's gods and brought them into his city and made a house for Baal in Samaria. So he was forcing the people to go away from worshiping the true God. So that's what's going on when Elijah is sent. God's people have been driven away from worshiping him correctly. So then we have Elijah. Who is Elijah? Like many prophets in the Old Testament, we don't have a backstory on him. The text just says, "Now he arrived." And so I'm going to shortly go through his entire story before we look at a few sections of it in more detail. So the short version of Elijah. He shows up without introduction, assuming you know who he is. He challenges the king and the evil queen directly. Through his personal statement, he withholds rain from the land, causing a multi-year famine. He is then fed by ravens during this. He leaves Israel because of the drought, and he sojourns with a widow. He blesses that widow with food for her and her household, proceeds to bring her son back from the dead, and then returns to Israel and individually challenges 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. During this challenge, he mercilessly mocks them all day while they fail to hear from Baal, and then he calls down fire from God. He then slaughters those 450 prophets of Baal, restores rain to Israel, outruns a chariot on foot over at least 17 miles. But he is still afraid of that queen, and so he runs away to hide. While he's hiding, he's fed by an angel while he mopes under a broom tree. He then travels 40 days to a cave on Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, and receives final instructions about who will be his successor. He then condemns the king publicly again and prophesies against him. He calls down fire from heaven on 2 different groups of soldiers who are sent to arrest him. He parts the Jordan River so that he can walk across on dry land, passes his spirit on to Elisha, and is taken up alive into heaven. In the New Testament, he shows up with Moses and Jesus during the Transfiguration. So how could I possibly cover all of that? The good news for you guys is I'm not going to try. I hope that I can make a few comments that may encourage you to go study some more and to see the details that I'm going to pass over this morning. But there were a few details that I want to mention so you can recognize some of what's going on in this story. Some stuff that we sometimes miss in our English translations. And so for these extra details, I mentioned that Baal was the foreign deity brought into Samaria. Baal was worshipped because he was a god of the weather. And so you worship a weather god, so he will bless you with rain. And a drought would specifically be a challenge against his power. If you're worshiping a god of rain who is not providing rain, that's a challenge. The name Elijah is literally the statement, "My God is Yah," which is a shortened version of the word Yahweh. So you have then the king of Sidon, whose daughter Ahab married. His name literally meant "with the help of Baal." So the characters in this story are at conflict with each other just by their names. And then Zarephath. I didn't mention it in the story, but that's the hometown of the widow that Elijah goes to sojourn with during the drought. That is a town in the country of Jezebel originally. So maybe now you understand that this isn't just prophets sent to disobeying people. This is being framed as a full-on conflict, a battle between the forces of God and the forces of a foreign god. And so out of all that story, I want to talk about 2 of Elijah's experiences in some more detail. It turns out that both of them take place on top of a mountain. The first of them, it takes place throughout 1 Kings chapter 18, and it is the climax of the conflict that started when Elijah caused a drought. Elijah, the servant of Yahweh, made a challenge against Baal, and then 3.5 years went by before the actual showdown between God's servant and between Baal's servants takes place. So we're going to read through all of that narrative. And then we're going to see what we can learn from it. So Elijah issues a challenge to Ahab, and then the following confrontation takes place. So Ahab sent to all the people of Israel and gathered the prophets together at Mount Carmel. And Elijah came near to all the people and said, How long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him." And the people did not answer him a word. Then Elijah said to the people, "I, even I only, am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Let 2 bulls be given to us, and let them choose 1 bull for themselves, and cut it in pieces, and lay it on the wood, but put no fire to it. And I will prepare the other bull, and lay it on the wood, and put no fire to it. And you call upon the name of your God, and I will call upon the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire, he is God." And all the people answered, "It is well spoken." Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose for yourselves 1 bull, and prepare it first, for you are many. And call upon the name of your God, but put no fire to it." And they took the bull that was given them, and they prepared it, and called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they limped around the altar that they had made. And at noon Elijah mocked them, saying, "Cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is musing, or he is relieving himself, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened." And they cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances, until the blood gushed out upon them. And as midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation, but there was no voice. No one answered, no one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come near to me." And all the people came near to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord came, saying, "Israel shall be your name." And with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord. And he made a trench about the altar, as great as would contain 2 seahs of seed. And he put the wood in order, and cut the bull in pieces, and laid it on the wood. And he said, "Fill 4 jars with water, and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood." And he said, "Do it a second time." And they did it a second time. And he said, "Do it a third time." And they did it a third time. And the water ran around the altar and filled the trench also with water. And at the time of the offering of the oblation, Elijah the prophet came near and said, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back." Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." And Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Let not one of them escape." And they seized them. And Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and slaughtered them there. Ever since I've been young, this story has appealed to me. Imagine, as a boy, you get to read about God's representative standing up for what is true, and God backs him up instantly. He's at the biggest challenge of his life. I can't even imagine barely speaking to 450, let alone challenging them across an entire day. Knowing that God will help you, but also not having seen it yet. And then in his moment of triumph, God comes through. His faith is rewarded, and all the people turn. Everyone who's standing there recognizes God has power. God speaks through his prophet, and he wants them to come back and worship him. And so we see our first takeaway of today, that faith's result can be immediate. Elijah speaks the word and God answers. The people see it, and his faith is vindicated. This is often how we want faith to be. We desire it this way, that when we are willing to step into that difficult situation, we want an answer, a confirmation. But this wasn't the only experience that Elijah had throughout his life. Some of the things that I passed over in the short version of his life demonstrated that he didn't always get an answer right away. There were at least 3 specific times when Elijah had to wait. He had to be persistent in asking before he saw his result. And so those 3 cases, when he was staying with the widow's son died, and Elijah brought that child back to life, but it wasn't immediate. It says that he had to ask 3 times before the son was revived. It's very short in the text, but we also have to remember that this drought lasted for more than 3 years. So all this time, Elijah is watching, and he's seeing and waiting. He knows he's doing what God has told him to do, to challenge the power of Baal, to demonstrate that it is God who blesses his people. But he still has to go through that time. He still has to live with this widow outside of his country, in the foreign land, before the results can be seen. At the end of his showdown with the prophets on the mountain, he sends his servant to go look for rain, because God promised him that he would send rain. And in that portion of the story, he has to send his servant to look 7 times before he finally sees the fulfillment. And that brings us to our second takeaway, that sometimes the results of our faith can be delayed. There can be a gap between us expressing that faith before God delivers on his promises. But there's a third side to faith, a different aspect that we sometimes don't consider or don't look at. We always want faith to be immediate, and we recognize that the fulfillment might take some time. It might take some persistence. It might take repeated asking. But the story of Elijah teaches us a third thing. It looks very specifically into how Elijah reacts in that gap in between. What happens when he's waiting, when he hasn't seen God come through yet? And he struggles with this. He struggles mightily. You may have remembered from when I blazed through the overview, I said he ran away from the queen, which is a strange response. He just stood up against a massive mob and claimed victory for God. And the next thing he does is run away. I also mentioned that he moped under a broom tree. And that was a statement made very specifically to capture the way he's feeling in this moment. He's feeling alone. He's feeling like he's doing what he should, and he's not seeing a result. And so that's what we're going to look at next, is Elijah's experience on a second mountaintop. where it's not the immediate victory. It's not the fulfillment that we jump to, that we forget how long these times can take. So we're going to read through the next section. This is after Elijah has left the land of Israel. He is on Mount Horeb, which is another name for Mount Sinai, the place where Israel had their year-long experience through Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, hearing from God. There he came to a cave and lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only am left, and they seek my life to take it away." Then he said, "Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu the son of Nimshi you shall anoint to be king over Israel. And Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. And the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death, and the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." So one of the things that is unique about the Bible is when it presents the stories of its heroes, it doesn't just paint them in a good light. It doesn't ignore their failings. It doesn't ignore their times of weakness. It actually focuses on them. It points out that Elijah was a person. He had his downtimes. He had his struggles. And right now, we're seeing him express his complaints. He's been sent to the people. He's done God's will. But it seems like it doesn't have a point. That he's on his own. That, like all the prophets before him, his message isn't heard. So why doesn't he just die? He has completely given up. But notice how God responds to him. God doesn't chastise him. He doesn't punish him. He doesn't say, "You failed in your mission." Instead, he whispers softly, and he just asks, "Why are you here?" And he doesn't tell him that he's failed. He tells him he still has more to do, and he sends him back. So God understands that Elijah has this moment. He's willing to meet him. in his low position, and he's willing to speak to him in a way that he can hear. We get an idea from this story that God expects him to be somewhere else. It doesn't say where that was, but we know that his message and his purpose wasn't done yet. But if you follow the path of the story, God says that he's served his purpose. And after this, he anoints his successors. He passes on his power and his spirit to Elisha. And then God lets him leave the earth. He gives him a reward for the service and the time that he had spent. He doesn't ask him to do more than he's capable of doing. Elijah had gotten to his breaking point. He'd spent multiple years watching the wickedness around him. He'd seen God's punishment on the people. Everyone in the area had suffered from the drought, and Elijah had to live through all that. He was only helping the one family, that widow and her household. But all the rest of the people had to suffer through the severe famine before God's purpose could be revealed. And this leads us to our third result. That sometimes, as we are living, we don't see the results of our faith. God's purposes can be hidden, and the results of our faith we don't recognize. But as we read through this story, we notice that God is always working. When Elijah is at his lowest, when he didn't know who else was still left in the land, there were still 7,000 that he didn't know about. He went up against 450 prophets of Baal, which seems like a lot, but there was so many more that were still faithful to the true God. And in his time of weakness, God told him, it isn't as bad as you think. There is a purpose that is still continuing, and the work will continue. Remember, at the end of the short description of Elijah's life, that he gets mentioned in the New Testament as well. He has a whole passage dedicated to his complaint and to his lack of faith in the moment. And yet, when Jesus is transfigured, Elijah is one of two people that shows up with him. Moses represents the law, and Elijah represents the prophets. Even with a time of doubt in his life, his faith is remembered. And so we have to remember that times of doubt are expected, times when our own individual struggles don't seem to have an answer. But that doesn't mean that God has given up on us. It doesn't mean that our actions haven't advanced God's purpose. It can be difficult in those times, but we aren't as alone as Elijah. I've never had a time when I felt like I was the last one. I always had another Christian to reach out to. Maybe I didn't take advantage of it. Maybe I left myself wallowing in my own doubt and my own lack. But I was always brought back from that. I mentioned when I started that Elijah, since I've been young, has been one of my favorite characters in the Bible. And that's usually because of reading about what he accomplished on Mount Carmel. How often do you read in the Bible where one of God's prophets gets to mock people. He gets to throw insults in the name of the Lord, and that's what he was supposed to do. That really appeals to me. But more than that, Elijah, I need to learn from the one who went and hid in a cave, who left his post and ran away, and God brought him back. He met him where he was, and he called him by name and said, "Why are you here?" And then sent him on forward. So that's everything that I have today. I hope that I have accurately portrayed the life of Elijah and the things that we can learn about a man of great faith. We always want to close with an invitation to anyone who may need encouragement, who may need prayers, who may need to be reminded that they're not alone and that God cares about them and that God's people will support them in whatever they need. And so if you have a need this morning, please let it be known while we sing our invitation song.